Welcome. In this video I'm going to show you how you can analyze a single ordinal variable using Excel and my stikpetE add-in. In order to follow along, you will have to install my add-in. It's available on my GitHub account. You can download the file from there. Once you've downloaded it, you can open Excel, go for File, Options, Add-ins, and then click on Go. Then click on Browse and go to the downloaded file. You might also have to right-click on the downloaded file first and go to the properties from the file, at least in Windows, and then actually select that you want to unblock the file. This video will focus on how to obtain the output, not so much on reading the output and how to interpret it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go over these 5 steps. I create a frequency table, I visualize the results, I then determine the median and as a measure of dispersion the consensus. Then I want to test if it's significantly different from the neutral option in my example and determine an effect size for it. There are also some alternatives as you can see here, and I'll quickly go over those as well. If you want some documentation about my library, you can also visit my website. I'll leave, by the way, a link to my website and this file in the description below where you can find it. I have some documentation for my R and my Python libraries, but they have the same functions except for visualizations. In Excel, I didn't make functions for visualizations. The example is about students being asked about how motivational this teacher was. And as you can see in column A, I have about 55 students. The first one is the column header. These were the orders that they should be in, so that can be useful as well. And the first thing I want to do is just create a frequency table from this data. I select tab frequency as my function, and then I do have to specifically say which range to use. So don't use the entire column A, that will not work, or at least it's going to be extremely slow. So don't do that with any of my functions. And because I want it in a specific order, I also specify that order. In previous versions of Excel, you sometimes had to use Ctrl-Shift-Enter, but now it just spills over, as they say, and it gives me the entire table. You might notice that the percentages do not add up to 100%, and that's because there are a few people who didn't answer this question. So those are the ones that are missing. The valid percentages do add up to 100% because they only include the ones that actually answered the question. I'm interested kind of in the cumulative percentages. I can see immediately that 76% was either neutral or scored less. And 54% even disagreed or fully disagreed. So they weren't too happy about this. Now I might want to visualize these results, and I don't have a function for that. So here's the diagram, a stacked bar chart. I have a separate video on that, but quickly to show you that can be done. The basics is to highlight with Control the data that you want in there, go for insert, and then in this case they call it a bar chart. Stacked, as you might notice, it's not really stacking up everything, but you can go in the chart design and for the switch rows, and now you kind of have the data. So you can then add the legend, etc., and then you get this nice diagram. I can see that at about 50% still most of the students disagree. So I'm guessing that the median, which is at 50%, will be at about that disagree. I can actually check for that. I can just run the median function, and when I run that, it in this case says neither disagree or agree. I'm not sure if that's actually correct. I will double check and adjust it if needed. Measure of consensus, I'm sure that's right, is to show a little bit about the variation, and in this case it's about 43, so that's quite a lot of variation in there. Now what I'm really after is to know if the neutral option would also be the middle option in the population. So in this case I only had 5 options going from fully disagree to fully agree, and the middle one is indeed neutral from those 5. Now if I use my function Wilcoxon-OS, it will actually test, well, not strictly speaking, not if the median will be there, actually the mean rank. But it will use the mid-range then, because I'm not specifying the value. and it will test if it might actually be significantly different from that in the population. So when I run this, I get to see how many ranks were actually used. I get to see what it actually used as a test value, in this case 3, which was the neutral, the W value, the test statistic, in this case Z value. Degrees of freedom are not applicable for this one, and here we have the so-called p-value or significance. That's the one that's probably the most important. It's below 0.05. Notice the double zeros after the decimal separator, and that usually indicates that there is a significant difference from this 3. So from neutral. So we could actually claim now that students were significantly dissatisfied with the motivational factor of the teacher. Now we can actually also add an effect size measure for that. I have found a correlation coefficient different than the Pearson one, which is kind of a famous correlation coefficient. So I'm calling this Rosenthal because that's the oldest reference I could find for it. So the function requires not the data, but actually the sample size, which in this case I presume is the number of ranks that were actually used in the calculation, and the Z value, so that's in this case the statistic. In this case it's about 0.43, and we could perhaps use simply the Pearson's correlations rules of thumb, and in this case that would then be classified as moderate, and that's according to this reference. And that's kind of how you can analyze a single ordinal variable using my stikpetE library add-in. Alternative visualizations could be a dual axis bar chart where you put each one separately and then add a cumulative line showing the cumulative percentages. As alternative measures, you could use quartiles. Many of the measures of dispersion are actually using also quartiles, but if you only have 5 options, quartiles in my opinion don't make much sense. But it can be done, so you can say, well, these I want to use the quartiles, again the same data range, and in this case the specific values to use, and it simply shows me that the first quartile, which is the value at 25%, the third quartile at 75% are actually the first, so the fully disagree, and 3 would be the neutral still. And here is the text interpretation as well for those. You can also use quantiles, by the way, then you can specify how many you want. The second quartile would actually be the median, and the zeros would be the minimum, and the fourth would be the maximum, which makes that there are 5 quartiles. The quartile range is actually a function that will can calculate different measures of dispersion. So if you don't specify a specific one, it will simply calculate the interquartile range, which is just the difference between these two. The semi-interquartile range does the same thing. Then you can specify the SIQR, but then it divides by 2. Or you can calculate the mid-quartile range. I need to change this to mid-quartile range. Quartile range, need to specify the name though. And that will give me the mid-quartile range. Alternative tests are also available. We can do a sign test. A sign test in essence just checks how many values fall below the hypothesized value and how many above, and then assumes that that should be 50-50, and then performs a one sample binomial test on that. See, analyzing a single binary variable for that one. It therefore excludes the ones that are equal to it, so you could also use a one sample trinomial test, and that actually then has 3 options. The ones that are above it, below it, and the ones that are tied. So this one doesn't exclude the ties. Last but not least, alternative effect sizes. You can calculate a rank by serial correlation coefficient if you like, with the mu value, and then it reports the rank by serial correlation coefficient. I also came across someone claiming for a dominance score, so I added it in as well, who also then had a so-called VDA-like or type of measure, and I added that one in as well. See the documentation for more details on those. Alright, and that's kind of it. I hope this was helpful. I'm going to fix that little issue that we still had, and thank you for watching.